The heart monitor flatlined, a shrill scream echoing through the sterile ICU. 3 top military surgeons had already given up on the shattered Navy SEAL bleeding out on the table. He was minutes from death, locked in a physiological surrender. Then, the new nurse leaned down and whispered a single, classified word. The tarmac at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany was slick with October rain when the C-17 Globemaster touched down. It was 0300 hours, and the flight line was devoid of the usual bustling logistics crews. Instead, a highly specialized medical extraction team waited in silence, the flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance reflecting in the puddles. They were waiting for a ghost. His official medical file listed him as John Doe, but the men in suits carrying heavily encrypted satellite phones hovering near the trauma bay knew his real name: Chief Petty Officer Colin Hayes. He was a Tier 1 operator, a Navy SEAL sniper who had been operating completely off the grid in a hostile, unnamed sector of the Sahel. When the rear ramp of the C-17 lowered, the smell of jet fuel mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of blood. The flight medics were performing continuous CPR as they rolled the stretcher down the ramp. "We're losing him!" one of the flight medics shouted over the roar of the engines. "Blood pressure is 50 over palp. Heart rate is a disorganized 40. We've pushed 3 rounds of epi, and he's not responding to the pressors." Waiting in Trauma Bay 1 was Dr. Harrison Mitchell, a veteran trauma surgeon who had spent 2 decades patching up the most elite warfighters on the planet. Mitchell was a man who rarely panicked, but as Hayes was transferred onto the hospital bed, even the seasoned surgeon felt a cold spike of dread. The man was practically ripped to shreds. A high-caliber round had shattered his right shoulder, plunging downward into his chest cavity. Shrapnel from an RPG blast had peppered his legs, and his tactical uniform was melted into his skin from secondary burns. But it wasn't just the physical trauma that was killing Colin Hayes. As Dr. Mitchell and his team worked frantically inserting chest tubes, Ho-negative transfusions of O-negative blood, and attempting to stabilize his shattered clavicle, something impossible began to happen. Colin's body began to actively fight the life-saving measures. Every time they administered a dose of adrenaline to restart his failing heart, his pulse would paradoxically slow down. When they adjusted the ventilator to push more oxygen into his lungs, his vocal cords seized, spasming to block the airflow. It was as if his central nervous system was operating on a completely inverted set of rules. "His vitals make absolutely no sense," Dr. Mitchell muttered, staring at the monitors. "He's in hemorrhagic shock, but his vascular system is constricting, like he's in a freezing environment. It's like he's actively shutting his own organs down." Standing quietly in the corner of the chaotic room was Abigail Carter. Abby was 32, a newly transferred civilian ICU nurse who had arrived at Landstuhl only 3 weeks prior. To the medical staff, she was just a quiet, highly competent nurse from Chicago, but her personnel file held a heavily redacted addendum. Before she had gone to nursing school, Abby had spent 6 years at Fort Meade as a signals intelligence analyst for the NSA, specializing in interrogations and physiological stress responses for Joint Special Operations Command. She had left that life behind after a deployment to Afghanistan went horribly wrong, seeking to save lives with her hands rather than end them with intelligence. Abby watched Colin's chest heave sporadically against the ventilator. She watched the way Dr. Mitchell ordered more drugs, more interventions, more chaos. And she realized, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that the doctors were treating a standard trauma patient. They didn't understand that they were treating a weapon that had been triggered into a self-destruct sequence. By the 3rd day in the ICU, Colin was dying. The infections had been cleared, the bleeding had been stopped, but his brain activity was mimicking a deep, irreversible coma. His organs were slowly failing one by one. The military brass had already flown his commanding officer in from Virginia to prepare for the inevitable. They were giving him 48 hours before they pulled the plug. Abby was assigned to the night shift, the quietest and most agonizing hours in the intensive care unit. The rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrators and the steady, depressing beep of the cardiac monitor were the only sounds in the dim room. She stood beside Colin's bed, holding a warm washcloth, gently wiping the soot and dried iodine from his left hand, the only part of him that wasn't wrapped in thick, white bandages. She looked at his face. Beneath the bruising and the endotracheal tube, he looked remarkably young. But the deep lines around his eyes told the story of a man who had stared through a rifle scope at the worst of humanity for over a decade. "What are you doing in there, Colin?" Abby whispered to the empty room, her eyes tracing the jagged scar across his jawline. She reached for his chart, flipping through the pages of desperate medical notes. Unresponsive. Progressive multi-organ failure. Suspected severe traumatic brain injury. Palliative care recommended. But as Abby set the chart down, her eyes caught a microscopic movement. Colin's left index finger, resting limply on the hospital bed railing, twitched. Abby froze. She stared at the finger. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. She exhaled, thinking it was just a random muscle spasm, a common occurrence in coma patients. Then, it happened again. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, 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 pause. Tap. Abby's breath hitched. Her blood ran cold as her past life, the life of intercepted radio transmissions, encrypted Morse code, and desperate prisoner of war signals came rushing back to her. She leaned closer, her eyes locked on his bruised finger. He wasn't seizing. He was communicating. Abby grabbed a pen from her scrubs and a blank napkin from the bedside tray. She watched Colin's index finger, her heart pounding against her ribs. She began to transcribe the micro-movements, translating the taps and pauses into the dots and dashes of tactical Morse code. Dash, dot, dash, dot, C, dash, 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 O, dot, dash, dot, dot, L, dot, 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 C. Wait, no, that didn't make sense. She crumpled the napkin and started over. She realized he wasn't using standard Morse code. He was using a modified, highly classified tap code, a specific variant taught only in the highest levels of SERE survival, evasion, resistance, and escape school, designed to be used by captured operators communicating through concrete walls in enemy prisons. Abby knew it because she had transcribed hours of it during her time at the NSA. She watched his finger, her pen flying across the paper. C, B, Eddie, I, reps, E, D, compromised. E, X, F, E, L, exfil. D, E, N, I, E, D, denied. Abby stepped back from the bed, a wave of profound realization washing over her. Colin wasn't in a coma from brain damage. His mind wasn't gone. He was trapped in a severe, stress-induced dissociative fugue. During his final mission, his team had been ambushed. He had been shot, bleeding out, and likely captured or on the verge of capture by hostile forces. His SERE training had kicked in at the highest, most extreme level. To prevent himself from giving up operational intelligence under torture, his brain had executed a catastrophic lockdown. He had voluntarily slowed his heart rate, shut down his peripheral nervous system, and retreated into the deepest, darkest corner of his own mind. He didn't know he was in a hospital in Germany. He thought he was lying in the dirt of a hostile desert, surrounded by enemies, waiting for an interrogation that would inevitably end in his execution. The doctor's needles felt like torture devices. The beeping of the monitors sounded like enemy radio chatter. That was why his body fought the adrenaline. That was why he stopped breathing when they touched him. He was trying to play dead. "Oh my God," Abby whispered. Just then, the heavy doors of the ICU swung open. "Doctor." Mitchell walked in, flanked by 2 military officers in dress blues. The surgeon's face was grim. "Nurse Carter," Dr. Mitchell said softly, checking his clipboard. "We're done. His kidneys have completely shut down, and his blood pressure is bottoming out. The commander here has given the authorization. We're moving to comfort care. Turn off the pressors and remove the ventilator." Abby instinctively stepped between Dr. Mitchell and the bed. "Doctor, wait. You can't. He's not in a coma." "Doctor," Mitchell frowned, his patience wearing thin after a brutal 2-4-hour shift. "Abigail, please step aside. The man's brain is starving for oxygen. His EEG is virtually flat. It's over." "He's running a SERE protocol," Abby said, her voice rising, shedding the quiet nurse persona. "Look at his hand. He's tapping out a compromise code. He thinks he's a prisoner of war. If you pull that tube, he will just let himself die to protect intelligence." One of the military officers, a stern-faced captain named Reynolds, narrowed his eyes at her. "Nurse, how the hell do you know about SERE tap codes?" "Because I used to decode them for JSOC," Abby snapped, not caring about her cover story anymore. She turned back to the doctor. "You've been treating him with bright lights, loud noises, and painful stimuli. You're mimicking an interrogation environment. Every time you try to save him, you're convincing his brain that he's being tortured." Dr. Mitchell looked at the military officers, then back at Abby. "Even if you're right, which is a massive medical improbability, his body is failing. We have minutes before his heart stops completely. How do you propose we snap him out of a psychogenic coma?" "We have to convince him he's been rescued," Abby said, her mind racing. "We have to authenticate." "Authenticate with what?" Captain Reynolds asked. His file is completely blacked out, We don't even know his unit's call signs. The Pentagon won't release that data over an unsecure line. Abby looked down at Colin. His breathing was growing shallower, the monitor letting out a long, terrifying warning beep as his heart rate dropped into the 20s. He was slipping over the edge. She closed her eyes, forcing her mind back to her days in the intelligence vault. She remembered a fragmented intercept from 3 years ago, a chatter log involving a legendary sniper element operating out of Somalia. She remembered a voice, calm and icy, calling in airstrikes while completely surrounded. She remembered the specific call sign that belonged to a man the enemy called the Ghost of the Sands. It was a massive gamble. If she was wrong, she would be whispering nonsense to a dying man. If she was right, she might just reach through the darkness and pull him back. Abby pushed past Dr. Mitchell and leaned directly over Colin's face. She placed her hands firmly on his uninjured left shoulder, pressing down with the specific grip of a friendly extraction harness. She leaned her lips inches from his ear. "It's over, brother," Abby whispered, her voice steady, mimicking the authoritative, calm tone of a combat rescue pilot. "The perimeter is secure. You are wheels up. Come back to us. Whiskey Actual." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the slow, agonizing beep, beep of the failing heart monitor. "Doctor," Mitchell sighed. "Nurse Carter, step away." But Abby didn't move. She kept her hands firmly on his shoulder. "I have the watch, Whiskey Actual. Stand down." Suddenly, the heart monitor shrieked. The slow, failing rhythm vanished, replaced by a rapid, violent spike. Beep, 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 beep. Colin's chest arched completely off the mattress. His left hand, the one that had been weakly tapping a code of death seconds before, shot upward with terrifying speed, grabbing Abby by the collar of her scrubs. His grip was like a vice, born of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. The endotracheal tube hissed as Colin's eyes snapped open. They weren't the glassy, unfocused eyes of a dying man. They were wide, dilated, and burning with a ferocious, violent clarity. He looked straight into Abby's eyes, gasping against the ventilator, his heart rate skyrocketing from 20 to 140 in 3 seconds. He wasn't dying anymore. He had just returned to the land of the living. Colin's grip on Abby's scrubs was inhumanly tight, the knuckles of his unbandaged left hand turning stark white. The ICU, which seconds ago had been a quiet tomb waiting for a corpse, erupted into absolute pandemonium. The cardiac monitor screamed a rapid, tachycardic rhythm, tracking a heart that had gone from a terminal crawl to a sprinting, terrified gallop. "Sedate him! Push 5 milligrams of Versed, now!" Dr. Mitchell roared, recovering from his shock and lunging toward the IV manifold. He viewed this sudden burst of consciousness not as a miracle, but as a terminal death throe, a final, violent spasm of an oxygen-starved brain that would inevitably tear the fragile sutures holding Colin's chest cavity together. "No! Do not push sedatives!" Abby shrieked, throwing her body weight across Colin's chest to shield his IV lines from the surgeon. "If you sedate him now, his brain will register it as a chemical interrogation. He'll crash his own nervous system again, and this time you won't get him back." Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of awe and fury. "Nurse Carter, stand down. You are interfering with a medical officer." Colin was thrashing violently, his eyes darting wildly around the sterile room. He was gagging, fighting the thick plastic endotracheal tube shoved down his throat. His shattered right shoulder ground against the mattress, fresh blood blooming through the thick white gauze. He didn't see a hospital in Germany. The frantic, dilated movement of his pupils told Abby he was still processing a hostile environment. He was looking for threats, assessing the angles of the room, identifying the people as potential captors. Abby knew she had less than 10 seconds before the panic induced a fatal heart attack. She leaned down, putting her face inches from his, forcing herself into his line of sight. "Whiskey Actual, look at me," she commanded, dropping her voice into the firm, unyielding cadence of a tactical controller. "Look at my eyes. You are at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, Ward 4, ICU. You are in Germany. You are secure." Colin's eyes locked onto hers. The feral, cornered animal panic in his gaze flickered, replaced by a cold, calculating suspicion. He stopped thrashing, though his chest continued to heave against the ventilator. He reached up with his left hand, bypassing Abby's collar, and wrapped his fingers around the endotracheal tube protruding from his mouth. "He's pulling his tube," a junior nurse screamed. "Let him," Abby yelled. "Doctor, deflate the cuff." Dr. Mitchell hesitated, looking at the monitors, then at the sheer determination in Abby's eyes. Swearing under his breath, he grabbed a syringe, attached it to the pilot balloon of the breathing tube, and rapidly deflated the cuff, securing it in Colin's airway. With a sickening wet slide, Colin yanked the 14-inch plastic tube out of his own throat, tossing it onto the floor. He rolled onto his side, coughing up a mixture of saline and blood, his lungs taking their first independent, ragged breaths in 3 days. The room was paralyzed. Doctor. Mitchell held a syringe of sedatives in mid-air. Captain Reynolds had instinctively dropped his hand to where his sidearm would normally sit. Colin collapsed back onto the pillows, his chest rising and falling heavily. He stared at Abby. His throat was shredded from the tube, his vocal cords bruised and raw. When he finally spoke, his voice was nothing more than a gravelly, agonizing whisper, carrying the dry, metallic rasp of the desert. Authentication, Colin wheezed. Abby swallowed hard. I gave you your call sign, Whiskey Actual. Colin's eyes narrowed, cold and dead. Russian GRU, knows my call sign. Syrian Mukhabarat, knows my call sign. You put me in a fake hospital room. You dress up like American doctors. It's a standard psychological theater. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. Authentication, challenge, broken arrow, identify. Abby felt the blood drain from her face. Broken arrow. It was a JSOC emergency protocol used when an element was overrun and calling in danger close air support on their own position. But Colin wasn't using it in the traditional sense. He was using it as a clearance challenge, a test designed to separate true Tier 1 operators from enemy intelligence assets trying to extract information. If she didn't know the exact, highly classified countersign to Broken Arrow, Colin would conclude he was in an enemy black site. His mind would snap the SERE protocol back into place. He would slow his heart back down to 20 beats per minute, and he would die. Captain Reynolds stepped forward. Son, I am Captain Thomas Reynolds, United States Navy. You are at Landstuhl. Stand down and let these doctors treat you. Colin didn't even look at the captain. His eyes remained fixed on Abby, completely ignoring the brass. Challenge. Broken Arrow. Identify. Abby's mind raced back to Fort Meade, the dark, air-conditioned skiffs, the endless hours listening to encrypted DevGru comms. The challenge codes rotated every 30 days. She had no idea what the current countersign was, but she knew the origin of the protocol. She knew the architecture of the JSOC mind. I don't have the current cryptologic countersign, Abby said softly, her voice steady. I haven't held a TS-SCI clearance in 3 years, but I know that your sniper element was attached to Task Force Black out of Camp Lemonnier. I know your primary exfil was supposed to be a paved strip outside of Wallam, and I know the last thing you transmitted before going dark was a visual on 3 hostile technicals. Colin's breathing slowed. The violent spikes on his heart monitor began to level out. You're an analyst, Colin whispered, the suspicion in his eyes fracturing, revealing the profound exhaustion beneath. Nissa. Signals intelligence. 6 years, Abby replied, never breaking eye contact. I tracked your biometric telemetry during the 2021 raid in Mogadishu. I know your resting heart rate is 42. I know you're allergic to penicillin. And I know you just tried to kill yourself to protect your operational data. Silence descended on the ICU, broken only by the steady, rhythmic, and now perfectly normal beeping of the cardiac monitor. Colin stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Slowly, the rigid tension in his shoulders melted away. The defensive posture of his left arm collapsed. He let his head fall back against the sterile white pillow, staring up at the fluorescent lights. I'm in Germany, he breathed, the words carrying the weight of a man realizing he didn't have to die today. You're in Germany, Abby confirmed, tears suddenly pricking the corners of her eyes. Doctor, Abby said, her voice trembling slightly, but commanding. Check his vitals. Doctor. Mitchell, looking as though he had just witnessed water turn into wine, stepped toward the monitors. Blood pressure is rising, 90/60 and climbing. Heart rate is a steady 85. Oxygen saturation is 94% on room air. He looked at Abby, utterly bewildered. His vascular system, it's dilating. His kidneys are producing urine again. It's like a switch just flipped. Because it did, Abby said, wiping her brow. He isn't fighting you anymore. His brain just told his body it's safe to heal. For the next 4 hours, Landstuhl's Trauma Bay 1 transformed from a quiet room of impending death into a chaotic crucible of life. Freed from the paralyzing, self-imposed grip of his psychogenic lockdown, Colin Hayes' body finally absorbed the medical interventions it had been violently rejecting. Dr. Harrison Mitchell and his surgical team descended on the bed with ferocious efficiency. They pushed broad-spectrum antibiotics, hung fresh bags of O-negative blood, and rushed to stabilize the shattered clavicle hemorrhaging internally. Through the grueling process of reinflating a collapsed lung and setting bone fragments, Colin endured it in absolute silence. His dark, haunted eyes tracked the medical staff, but they never left Abby Carter for more than a few seconds. She was his anchor to reality, the only proof he wasn't lying in a lightless enemy black site. By dawn, the gray pallor of an impending corpse had vanished, replaced by the bruised but living flesh of a survivor. The cardiac monitor, once a source of terror, hummed with a strong, steady rhythm. At 0600 hours, the heavy double doors of the ICU swung open. Captain Thomas Reynolds marched in, his face a mask of bureaucratic urgency. He was flanked by two stern-faced intelligence officers in civilian suits, one carrying a heavily encrypted SATCOM briefcase. They reeked of Langley. "Chief Hayes," Reynolds barked, the sharp tone of military authority returning. He glared down at the wounded SEAL. "You've given the Pentagon one hell of a scare, but I have JSOC command on a secure feed. Your entire six-man element was wiped out in the Sahel. We need to know who ambushed you, and how they found a Tier 1 ghost team." Colin slowly turned his head. He looked at the CIA identification lanyards peeking from the officers' pockets, then leveled a dead stare at Reynolds. "Clear the room," Colin rasped, his voice like crushed glass. "Excuse me?" Reynolds bristled. "Chief, I am your commanding officer here. You will provide a debrief. You do not have the compartmentalized clearance for what I am about to say," Colin interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but the venom commanded the room. "My op was a special access program. Need to know. And you, Captain, do not need to know." Reynolds flushed a deep crimson. "I will have you court-martialed." "He's legally right, Captain," the older CIA officer, a man named Sterling, stepped forward. "If his mission falls under Title 50 covert action, we aren't cleared without direct authorization from the Director of National Intelligence." "Then who the hell is he going to tell?" Reynolds snapped. "The men who killed his team are getting away." Colin raised his trembling left hand, pointing a bruised index finger directly at the nurse, standing quietly by the IV racks. "Here." Abby blinked, her breath catching. "Me? Colin, I'm a civilian now. I don't have an active TSSCI clearance." "You speak the language," Colin said, stripping away her civilian scrubs with his gaze, and seeing the seasoned NSA analyst beneath. "If I tell them, the intel gets routed through standard African command channels. Standard channels are why my brothers are dead." The room went dead quiet. "You're alleging a leak," Sterling said softly. "I'm alleging a massacre," Colin corrected, gritting his teeth against a brutal chest spasm. He looked intensely at Abby. "Grab a pen, Carter. I'm only saying this once." Furious, but outranked by the terrifying hierarchy of black operations, Reynolds nodded to Sterling. The three men backed out, sealing the heavy doors. Abby grabbed a medical notepad. She sat cautiously on the edge of his bed, her heart pounding with a familiar, adrenaline-fueled rhythm she thought she'd left at Fort Meade. "Go," she said softly. "Target location was Grid 1-4, Alpha, Tillaberi region," Colin began, staring blankly at the ceiling, observing a weapons transshipment site. "No engagement authorized. At 0200 hours, we were flanked. Highly trained mercenaries. Russian-made VSS Vintorez sniper rifles. They didn't stumble upon us. They walked a perfect U-shaped ambush into our hide site. They knew our exact GPS coordinates." Colin paused, squeezing his eyes shut as the heart monitor beeped faster. "They wiped out my spotter in the first volley. We returned fire, fell back to the secondary rally point, but they were waiting there too. They weren't hunting us, Abby. They were waiting for us." "How did they get your coordinates?" Abby asked, writing frantically. "Before we deployed, our primary logistics liaison at Camp Lemonnier insisted on a frequency change for our SATCOM radios, claiming Russian electronic jamming." Colin looked deep into Abby's eyes. "Every time we transmitted a location update, we were broadcasting our coordinates directly to the hostile element." Abby felt a violent chill. "The liaison is a double agent." "Yes. The liaison's network codename is Goliath," Colin whispered. "When I took the round to my chest, I knew if I called for medevac, the Black Hawks would fly directly into a surface-to-air missile trap. I buried my radio and initiated the SERE protocol. I had to become a black box, so the next SEAL team wouldn't walk into the same trap." He grasped Abby's wrist. "You cannot hand this to Reynolds or the CIA. Use your old NSA back channels. Tell the director of JSOC that Goliath is compromised. Tell them my men didn't die for nothing." Abby squeezed his hand. "I've got it, Colin." I'll use a burn protocol cipher. I swear it. Colin let out a long, trembling exhale. Good. I have the watch, Carter. You. Take the comms. Sleep, Chief, Abby said softly. You're safe now. Colin Hayes walked out of Landstuhl 3 months later, a ghost returning to the shadows. The intelligence he protected dismantled a compromised network, saving dozens of American operators. Abigail Carter remained in the ICU, trading intercepted transmissions for the quiet rhythm of healing hearts. Two warriors, brought together by a whispered call sign, proving that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't a drug, but the sound of home